So hi, again, I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and welcome to the Digital Economy Lab Lunch Seminar. We're going to have a conversation with Herman Narula, sitting here with me. Herman's the co-founder and CEO of Improbable. It's a British Metaverse technology company. Improbable partners with video game developers, entertainment companies, and defense and academic institutions to enable powerful virtual worlds of unprecedented size and usefulness. And we'll hear a little bit about that in a minute. He's also the author of this amazing book, Virtual Society. I've been reading it. It is really well written and has a lot of insights about the future of virtual society, the metaverse and new frontiers of human experience. And that's what we're going to focus our discussion on today. We welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. For those of you in the Zoom audience, please just submit your questions using the Q&A function. We'll do our best to try to keep up with those. For those of you, the many of you who are here at Stanford, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. The plan is Herman and I will have a little conversation for the first, 30 minutes or so, maybe 45 minutes, and we'll get all of you involved during that time. The seminar goes for an hour. The last part will focus very much on your questions. So Herman, welcome to Stanford. Like I said, I really enjoyed this book. I think this term metaverse has been used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. It seems to be evolving every week that I hear about it. Some people associate it with VR or with blockchain or other things. What's your definition of the metaverse?
So I think one of the things that's important to start with is, why does the definition matter, right? I think for me as a technologist and as an entrepreneur, why it matters is because it defines a TAM, defines a market. It defines
total addressable market.
Yeah, sure. It defines whether or not investors will invest in something. It'll define how capital is put to use. Defines what kind of problems are worth solving and what kind of problems aren't worth solving. Like if you define the metaverse to include smart TVs, VR headsets, and Disney Plus, then it makes absolutely no sense how anyone pursues this because it's too broad and too wide. I also think it's important because there's a lot of intentional deception around how the metaverse is approached to serve people's sort of short-term goals. So if you're a video game company, it makes a lot of sense to suddenly redefine yourself as a metaverse company, because maybe you're going to get a better multiple. But actually the video games industry has grown like 7-8% every year for the last 30 years, maybe this year shrinking because of COVID. So it can't just be video games. So for me, the metaverse is something a lot more than just video games. It represents a network of experiences, events, identities, and digital assets, which facilitate this, powerful fulfillment economy in which people can have all kinds of valuable experiences. And for me, what matters in the definition of the metaverse is that it is a network, that it involves the exchange of value between experiences, and that it isn't necessarily limited to today's technology. Like you could find the metaverse and kind of similar exchanges of value when you look at the world of sport and you look at the real world, or when you look at other forms of kind of culture in our economy. I think the metaverse is a growing up of that idea and a supercharging of it with kind of new technology.
So Facebook famously changed its name to Meta and has bet the company on the metaverse. A big part of that seems to be VR. Is that from your definition, VR didn't seem to play that central a role?
I think VR is a nice to have in the context of the metaverse. So VR can improve immersion. And I define immersion as the feeling that the world is real. And for a lot of lay people who don't play games or who are not familiar with the games industry, sort of makes sense that the more real the world is, the more valuable the experience. But actually that isn't true. If you look at some of the biggest hits of the last sort of few years, Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite, these are all games for those that aren't familiar. Their graphics are...
How many people here have played Minecraft?
Minecraft, Roblox, yeah. Fortnite, yeah.
Okay.
So their graphics are actually quite primitive compared to other games on the market, and yet they are vastly superior to them in their scale. That's because they don't...
How many people play Minecraft?
Hundreds of millions of
hundreds
people.
of millions of people.
Yeah, I mean, Minecraft is
And
everywhere.
for those of you who haven't played, it's like these very clunky blocks that you just kind of...
You just move blocks around, right?
Yeah, but the graphics are pretty low res.
They intentionally look like pixelated games from the 90s, right? Fortnite too is made by a company capable of photorealistic graphics, but yet it chooses to do more simplistic things. So while VR is great for the idea of the world feeling real, it isn't so great necessarily for presence. Presence is the feeling that the world thinks you are real. So when you're in a crowded stadium and you hear everyone's voices and you can speak and they can hear you, you feel a sense of presence. Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite, they focus on the interactivity and the ability for people to influence the world, because that, as we'll come to, is fundamental to why these experiences are valuable. So Can VR make experiences more valuable? Sure. But it isn't an essential component in actually building a metaversal economy. It's just a nice to have.
So these ticks of Moore's law making things more and more realistic, and I was just looking yesterday at some of the simulations where there was what was the game? Not Grand Theft Auto, one of the shooter games where they had a simulation of Amsterdam, and I actually couldn't tell the difference between the simulation and photography. Obviously, a lot of computer power, a lot of energy went into doing that. But what you're saying is that actually is that misdirected? Is that
I would say there's a different technological hurdle which parallels visual fidelity that's far more important. And you see this talked about even in Facebook's own public conversations. So Facebook cryptically said this time around, in order to really unleash the powers, we need to be having rooms with lots of people in them, more than 50, more than 100.
How many people are in the Facebook meta?
You can have like less than 100, maybe 20, 30 people wandering around.
Like right now, how many people you figure are playing it?
I think the data they've publicly said is that, so just to put the numbers in perspective, playing Counter-Strike, which is quite an old game, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people while I speak to you right now in games of Counter-Strike. The entire monthly active user base of Facebook's metaverse is 200,000 people, according to Facebook. And you can divide by 10 to get the sort of daily actives, and then divide by 10 again to get people at this time. So there's probably a comparable number of people listening to this seminar as they are inside Facebook's $14 billion metaverse.
Wow.
That should indicate a problem.
Gotcha. And another technology that's often increasingly associated with the metaverse is blockchain. And I know you've done some work on that. Tell us whether is that relevant? If so,
yeah,
why?
So you mentioned a second ago, we talked about VR, so I'll just touch briefly on the back end part, then I'll come to blockchain.
Yeah.
So the thing that is important is how much change, how many useful interactions can take place in a world or in a simulation. That ultimately caps its value in a lot of different ways. So if you want thriving commercial real estate in the metaverse, or you want to bring a university campus or whatever it might be, you need to support many of what are known as operations per second. So this is a metric. It's a bit like bandwidth for the metaverse. It's how many things can change simultaneously in a world such that every other participant can see them. And you can basically tie this very concretely to the economic value of that world and for its ability to produce a lot of interesting experiences. That number has to be not in the thousands like modern games or in the millions, but in the billions for you to be able to really handle an interesting
because
world.
if you have a couple 100,000 people, if I'm like over here and I like swing my sword, that potentially could affect you.
Exactly. It's the chain of causality, both in the experience and more broadly in the world, which makes a metaverse and the experiences in a metaverse valuable. So that requires a huge amount of computational power on the back end rather than on the graphics, which isn't being worked on or talked about as much. And blockchain is important too because, well, blockchain-like systems are important because they mean that the things that happen in the metaverse can actually start to affect the real world through the transfer of value, through the transfer of entitlements and identity. It's this idea of a consequential network that underpins why all of this stuff matters. And if you need evidence for that, just look at sport, right? What matters is, it doesn't really matter what happens. It wouldn't matter what happened in a stadium if lots of people weren't watching, if it didn't affect the real world, if the star couldn't become famous, if it couldn't impact the real
so it does
economy.
have to affect the real world?
I think, my definition of the metaverse, I think the trade, the transfer of value between worlds, of which the real world and our real context is an important one, vastly increase the value of the metaverse. So you can have a metaverse without it influencing
what
the
if
real
it's
world.
self-contained and people just go there and interact and then they pop out into the real world?
You remember there's this, some people may be familiar with South Park, and there was a really funny South Park episode where they tried to make a big deal out of World of Warcraft. And every now and then they'd make a joke. They'd be like, oh my God, we need to save the world of Warcraft. And there'd just be like a moment where they'd poke fun at the fact that this doesn't really affect the real world. Compare that, for example, with...
But part of what's funny about that is there are people who do take it very seriously.
They are. And as I argue in the book, a decent proportion of society taking seriously the events that happen in an imaginary world is an important prerequisite to that imaginary world really becoming valuable.
Are you going to tell me next that sports is an imaginary world?
It is, but it's one that society has decided to take very seriously. If you run in front of Brazilian fans as they weep at the loss of, like in the last World Cup, and you tell them it's just a game, you won't escape with your life, right?
Exactly.
Why is that? Why does that happen in the context of that? Why does that get front page news? But World of Warcraft and the important events that still affect millions of people that happen in World of Warcraft don't. It's because there's something about our relationship with that world that is different. right? And this is the other key idea about the metaverse. It can't just be video games. It has a lot in common with video games in the sense that these are virtual experiences, but it's our relationship to them and their relationship to each other that unlocks this new value.
Well, this is the Digital Economy Lab, so let's talk about the economics side of things. And I'll relate it to my son, Luke. I don't know if he's listening online there, but he used to play Minecraft a lot. You mentioned that earlier. I think it was like a decade ago, he set up a server on Minecraft, and people would pay real US dollars to participate in this little world that he had set up. Is that the metaverse?
That is like the beginning of a proto metaverse. Okay. So the way I would describe it is games like Second Life. Like my co-founder paid his way through college by selling weapons in Second Life. So that was very meaningful. That was very
selling
important.
Them for real money.
Yeah, for real money. Yeah, digital weapons, of course,
so
not actual weapons.
So somebody wanted like a jewel-encrusted sword, and he somehow had a way of making them?
Yeah, actually, it's even funnier than that. So there was an adult district in Second Life, and the adult district wanted to have weapons to protect the entrance to the adult district. And he would make and sell those weapons, which he could program. He even learned to code inside Second Life. So Second Life obviously had limitations. Those limitations, like a lot of early internet companies, had less to do with the business model and more to do with just the absence of internet users.
How many people are playing Second Life right now?
There's more people playing Second Life right now by an order of magnitude than are playing Facebook's Metaverse. Right, and still, I think I talked to Phil Rosedale about this recently. I think it's still like 50,000 people.
So you called Minecraft Second Life the sort of proto. So what is it missing to make it, the metaverse as you would define it?
It's the bandwidth of value exchange between that world and the real world, and it's the ability to attract both the kind of investment and the sorts of experiences that are really going to unlock value. So we'll take an example. Second Life used to break down repeatedly whenever it had more than 60,000 people online at any one time. And a lot of the things people wanted to do with their land in Second Life, like having a concert or bringing like a bunch of people together, would break the system. So the ability to support high concurrency is absolutely fundamental to creating a valuable society in digital space.
So is it a matter of scale that it's
density? Density is much more important than scale. Scale is important, but so is density. The possibility of a dense space might seem like a feature, but in at least my estimation, it's a far more important factor for a lot of the industries that are most going to benefit from the metaverse. Music, fashion, sports. People who have huge global populations, but very limited engagement and monetization of those populations. They need to bring their fan bases together, and doing that requires density.
You mentioned the word land a little while ago. So most of us think of land as like, beachfront property, physical stuff, and it's scarce. Like, there's only so much land on Earth. In the metaverse, you can make bits, you can make as much land as you want, but people pay for it.
Do you know what's so funny? Even before you get into the blockchain of land, in all of the instances of land existing in MMORPGs, scarcity has tended to emerge. So I used to play, I was a pirate that gave home loans in a role-playing game. Don't ask, it's a long backstory. But in this particular role-playing game.
Just like real home.
Just like real home loans. It was, apparently pirates are more trustworthy in that world. But anyway, the property that existed in this game, and this game had no real money transfer in and out of the world. The designers of the game routinely tried to reorganize the city to make it so people spread out more. But people always inevitably preferred the property by the entrance to the city.
What do you mean? I mean, there's no space in. You can teleport from one space to the other, right?
So, points of interest. So think of it like a topology, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be more value in any made-up world of objects, people, and things that are more important or closer in importance or closer to other valuable things. So, for example, there was only one pub in that city, and the owner of that pub had undue influence, and so an economy sprung up around that. Right? It's funny, but even in limitless abundance, once you introduce the way humans behave, form groups, the way they tell stories, the way they create experiences, scarcity quickly emerges.
And we've already talked a little bit
about emerges,
how there's transfer of money within the game. Also, like with my son Luke, outside of the game, people or your friend buying and selling inside and outside the game. That can be done with dollars, but we were talking earlier that there's a lot of in-kind value being created, that when I participate in the metaverse and you participate in the metaverse, we're creating value for each other, even without dollars being exchanged.
And this has actually been one of the limiting factors in the development of a really robust metaverse, and why I think cryptocurrency and blockchain are so important. Not necessarily because I love their current incarnations, but because they solve a really important problem. In all the examples we've talked about, there's an implied central company or platform that is running the world. Why is that bad? I mean,
like Meta.
Yeah, well, even if we get away from Meta, let's just take Second Life as an example, or even any other virtual world we can think of. It's not bad like for moral reasons particularly. It's bad for really simple economic reasons, which is if you're a content creator building content inside Roblox or inside Meta's world or inside Fortnite, which you can do, or in Minecraft.
Right.
What's your revenue multiple going to be when you go and raise money? Are you going to be able to list your company on the NASDAQ on the basis that you make content inside Roblox? No. Why not? Because you're wholly dependent on this other company and your revenue will be heavily discounted.
That other company can at will just say, yeah, that's nice what you have there, we'll take it.
Yeah, in the same way that if I like had a business based in a dictatorship, right? And that dictatorship was highly unstable and very self-serving, the value of that company is going to be much, much less. And the desire for people to invest in it is going to be much less. And that problem is compounded when you consider that the people who can create the most valuable experiences, celebrities, brands, IP holders, they've kind of gotten wise since the dot-com boom. The last thing that LVMH wants to do is give its hundreds of millions of users and fans to Facebook so that Facebook could become more valuable. They want to be part of running the platform too. And what Web3 based tools and technology loosely accomplish isn't really around how consumers can own digital assets and move them around. You can accomplish that without it. It's how companies can collaboratively own user bases and own aspects of a digital economy while robustly investing.
Well, this has some, parallels with nations and nation states. And there was a time when the king in England and elsewhere kind of had absolute power. And then the nobles got together and created the Magna Carta and said, we're going to put some limits on what you can take and what you can do.
Do you know what's so really, really eerie? We started doing exactly this with M Squared, which is our kind of network of worlds. We don't have to talk about that right now, but the first rule all participants in the network ended up agreeing was exactly the same thing as the barons forced the King of England to agree to, which is no increase in taxes without collective approval. The very, very first rule, the very first thing was you can't increase taxes without approval. And that's the very first thing we've agreed to. There's like a 2% take rate, which the network itself gets, not us as a company, the network, and it's distributed to everybody. So I think there's a lot of parallels.
That's amazing.
And
that
in fact,
is really cool. By the way, there's a lot of interesting people in the room here. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I also see people are beginning to put questions into the Q&A online, so feel free to do that as well. Let me pick up on that theme. We've been talking to some folks about putting together something that's analogous to the Federalist Papers. So in America, they also, once upon a time, had a king, and they had a set of rules that changed that. And James Madison and others wrote a series of papers that had a set of principles that they thought were important for this new country. And I wonder if we are sort of at a stage where we need a similar sort of digital society papers that describe what should be the rules of the new digital economy.
We need that, and it's not. And I would caution people who think, is this sort of like getting ahead of itself, right? Because where are the users, where's the world, where's things together? I think there are some immediate questions which are raised as you move from a gray market economy to a white market economy in support of a metaverse. For example, if like my kid earns $50 for selling digital assets in a game, is that a job? Like, is he taxed? Is he liable? Is somebody employing him? How does that work? So the forms of informal labor and trade and exchange that occur within the metaverse, and the fact that they occur across borders, and the fact that they're going to involve a combination of professional and semi-professional individuals really raise a lot of complications and questions. Another good example is digital land. Like, there's a lot of very robust property rights in every country in the world. Like land has very specific rules. Mortgages.
Not in every country, but
well, in all the ones that we want to invest in.
We've evolved property rights that are pretty strict, in part because it seems like there's more wealth creation when you have property rights.
Sure, like nothing.
Or maybe some people think that they're
perhaps
given
too far, but nothing stops anybody here doing the equivalent of a South Seas bubble type thing on the internet right now. You could make up digital land, and consumers have no protections against you representing yourself as creating something that'll have future value, and it's not easy for consumers to diligence that. So I think we also have to think about what sort of regulatory framework is going to help these economies to run and operate, and no one's really doing that yet.
Part of the reason I was excited to have you here and read your book is that it's not hard for me to convince myself that in 5, 10, 20 years, people will be spending a lot of their time in something like the metaverse, like what you've described. Already, Americans spend about 7 or 8 hours a day looking at screens, whether it's a computer screen, a TV screen, a iPhone. So like maybe half their time is looking at a 2D screen. It seems plausible to me that that number could grow and that it would become more immersive. And so if you start spending a majority of either your leisure or your work or both time in this world, then that's a very different economy from what we have today. Or well, we're already getting partway there, but it'll be pretty different. Is that, do you have that vision that we'll be spending a lot of our time in a space like that?
I do, and actually, if you'll permit me, I think this is probably the most interesting and most hard to grasp, and I hope if somebody can see why I'm wrong, they can kind of hammer this point in the questions.
One of these people
of the whole thing. When I think it was like Schwarzschild or someone who, when Einstein first started publishing his basic ideas on general relativity, he became really mentally disturbed by the idea of a singularity. Like, it became clear to him that, like, the laws of gravity created the notion of a black hole, and this singularity offended him, like psychologically offended him, this idea of this warped thing in space. But it was an inevitable consequence of the rules of the world.
Right.
My sense is the inevitable consequence of self-determination theory, the idea that human beings have a limitless appetite for fulfilling experiences, and that the good life we all seek will come from a greater and greater abundance of fulfilling experiences, which need to be generated through ever more complex means. I think it takes us to a place where we will see a sort of singularity where the majority of our lives are going to be spent in this sort of multiversal other reality. And I don't think that'll necessarily be mediated by VR headsets. But, you know, brain-computer interfaces are not an implausible technology. They don't require any new physics. I could certainly see a situation 50, 100, 150 years from now where the majority of the purpose of our economic activity in the real world is to facilitate the experiences we have in other realities and in other worlds.
And you talk about how those could be even more real or amazing than what we have today. In the book, you talk about Plato's parable about the shadows in the cave.
First story my mother ever told me, yeah.
So why don't you tell the version of it that you have in the book and how it relates to the metaverse?
So for those that aren't familiar, the basic structure of the story is, imagine a cave in which the inhabitants of that cave have never seen the real world. All they've ever seen are shadows of the real world. Well, that's all of us, because the best we currently know is that our brains are capable of visualizing things through the visual cortex that our eyes cannot send them, right? Like, you're looking at reality through a keyhole. Your experience of reality is substantially diminished compared to what your brain is capable of experiencing. If you've ever had a really ridiculously vivid lucid dream or taken a bunch of illicit substances, you know the possibilities of your mind are far greater than your everyday experience. So it stands to reason then that perhaps over time, as we develop ever more sophisticated, ever more complex, ever richer virtual experiences, that you'll be able to experience things you could never experience in the real world. And I hasten to add that for a lot of people around the world, it doesn't require magical technology. Like, if you're an Indian cricket fan, like a passive Indian cricket fan who has a phone, you've never been to Lord's cricket ground, perhaps. You've never actually experienced the thrill of being in a crowd of people. If the metaverse can give you the chance of actually experiencing talking to your favorite player, or being part of something, or more importantly, contributing back in a public and visible way to your sport, that's a fulfilling experience you could never have in the real world. I think that suggests a pretty potent new economy arising from that, a fulfillment economy.
How can all these fans contribute back in a meaningful way?
Once you're inside a virtual space, like, we've done a bunch of experiments over the last year. So for those that aren't familiar, we're the only company on the planet capable of supporting not 100, not 1,000, but tens of thousands of people in rich virtual environments, all speaking with their own voices. And the behavior we've witnessed in these experiences has completely changed my mind about the whole topic. Like, it's really, really strange. People react in large crowds online in ways you wouldn't expect. They can get their voices heard. They can grow larger and suddenly communicate in ways they couldn't. Celebrities, like we did a K-pop concert, and the crowd play off of each other in ways that are impossible in the real world. So it's a much more high bandwidth medium for certain kinds of communication and to see and be seen, which is what fans seem to want.
In addition to writing this book, which just came out, it's now available?
Yeah, it's just been like 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Yeah. You're also, as I mentioned, the CEO, founder of Improbable. Why don't you just take 60 seconds to explain what is Improbable? It's not making headsets.
No.
It's what is its technology?
So we do two things. Well, three things rather. We build the technology that allows you to have richer virtual experiences. So we do everything necessary to increase that operations per second number. So at latest count, we can do about 2 billion messages a second on the back end. For context, WhatsApp does 1 million messages a second to support the entire population of people on WhatsApp. Why does that matter? Because it lets us unlock all of these really valuable experiences. We then take that technology and we work with really big brands, companies, sports leagues, and other partners, and some of which you may have publicly seen earlier this year. And we're building metaverses which they can own and control and which are also linked to each other. So these worlds are platforms that can support new experiences, and they all tie together into a digital economy.
Cool. So I've got more questions, but I'm seeing questions come in. Let's take a couple of them. We'll start with one from Ronald Berry. He asks, what are your thoughts on the key use case focus areas for Meta in the future outside of gaming and training and readiness?
Do you mean the metaverse, or do you mean the company Meta?
I think they mean the company. So, but I think it'd be interesting for you to just maybe start with that, but then go beyond what are sort of the broader use cases.
So I mean, I think with Meta there are two things. They've got the headsets, and then they've got their software. Their software so far doesn't seem to have found any specific use case, including gaming. But I think the headsets are very promising. They look like they're going to be applied to a lot of like real-world professional use cases, improve immersion. One of the use cases I don't think will be real is a great example of a red herring is like Zoom meetings in VR. The reason why is because they're not substantially better than normal Zoom meetings, and yet they're extremely inconvenient and costly. So there are some examples where this isn't going to work, but military training, absolutely. Like my company does a lot of work with the UK government on simulations of countries for military purposes. VR headsets would be fantastic in that context.
How many people here have tried VR headsets and just get a sense of it? Most people, yeah.
I'm a fan of VR, I should say. I just don't necessarily think it's fundamental to the metaverse.
So here's another question, a little harder. Elizabeth Allen asks, how can we create virtual worlds that don't just replicate and exacerbate existing social problems and ills like racism, sexual harassment? How do real-world geopolitical specific laws seek to curb these bad behaviors, and how do they apply in the metaverse?
That's a fantastic question. And I think what gives me a lot of hope is what keeps people engaged in video games, which is, we have a lot of empirical evidence on this, is fulfillment, right? Fulfillment means you have to have your needs satisfied in competence, the feeling of getting better at something, relatedness, meaning something to other people, autonomy, making meaningful choices. And you can't fake fulfillment. You can't like fake it the way you can give someone a fake dopamine hit in the ad economy of making them angry or whatever. Like you have to actually be fulfilled, right? And that requires these worlds to do that. And if people don't find that fulfillment, they churn and they go into another hyper-competitive game experience or world. One of the reasons social media is so toxic is there's nowhere else to go. You know, they have such powerful network effects that in the end, right, there's like one world. That world directly reflects the real world. And the monetization is entirely through attention as opposed to engagement. One of the fun things you'll see in in-game economies for virtual worlds is that the way that they handle the super rich is completely different to the real world. So one of the fun things about most MMOs, for those that have played, is there's a real effort to ensure that those that have accumulated the most power don't make the game boring for everybody else or have an endless advantage. Like there's a need to balance it, because unlike our real economy, people can just leave, right? So if I'm a new starter in that economy, starting with nothing, I want to see progression and I want to understand how my relationship works there. So there are a lot of positive things that can balance this in a better direction.
So
choice.
Part of your argument is that if you have a closed world where people can't leave, then powerful people can start abusing it. But if you have a way out, then it kind of creates a safety valve and forces people to treat people with more respect.
Yes, but also the world itself is powered by a continuous exchange of effort by all participants in order to create fulfillment. A great example is like if you know, there are role-playing games where you have cops and robbers. The cops and robbers are contesting each other. If either side creates a really unfulfilling, boring outcome for the other, then the world falls apart, right? You know, so the need for everyone to perform their labor sort of drives the world towards more fulfilling use
cases. So you're not envisioning one big metaverse that we're all part of, but lots of competing metaverses and people move between them?
I see a lot of networks, and I can give a great proof, existence proof about why that will be. Is anyone here a fan of Harry Potter? Enjoy Harry Potter? Ever like Harry Potter? How would you like to play in a would you like to go to Hogwarts? Would you ever have enjoyed the idea as a kid to go there to really? I would. I mean, I looked many times for the letter, never came, but you know, that's how these things go. The last thing I'd want while I'm at Hogwarts is for like a Russian soldier to break in and open fire and kill Dumbledore, right? But if you combine Call of Duty with Hogwarts, that's gonna happen. So there's definitely going to be limits on the kinds of experiences that network together and how they network together. And so you're gonna end up with related experiences forming clusters and not necessarily connecting to other experiences, because it breaks the continuity.
Because part of what you were saying earlier is you wanted people to be able to connect and bring their
value.
Assets from one place to another, and now you're saying you want to have some boundaries that prevent them from doing that. How's that negotiated?
It's exactly like real world trading blocks. So it's advantageous or not to connect certain worlds together. I'll give an example. All of our metaverse customers, every single one of them that have propelled our company to profitability in a short space of time, all outside of gaming. Even though we're the largest provider of multiplayer expertise in the games industry, every single metaverse customer is fashion, music, sport. Why? because they want their content to relate to the content of other companies and partners, because that's how their business works in the real world. The games industry is very different. It breaks your sense of immersion to randomly connect one game experience to another. And this is something the press and the general conversation around the metaverse has really ignored. Mostly because people have been reading Ready Player One and projecting that into a business strategy, which is a terrible, terrible mistake.
You don't think that's a good model?
It is. It would be like I came to you and said, hey, I have this great economic idea. I just read The Lord of the Rings. I'm thinking, what if the orcs, right? What if we make Mordor? I mean, it doesn't. Ready Player One and a lot of the science fiction in the 80s that have kind of inspired some of Tech Elite, they're just stories. They're stories that are not based on consistent worlds, which make sense in and of themselves. And it's shocking to me how they have been projected forward into business strategy. It's actually really worrying and really concerning that that's been allowed to happen. And I think kind of a symptom of the sort of very cheap capital that existed over the last 10 years and the sort of flights of fancy that companies have been allowed to pursue as a result.
Are there any...
He says, as a person who raised a lot of money during that time, but still, yeah.
Are there any books, stories, movies, science fiction tales that you find useful as metaphors?
I'd say, looking at ancient history is really, really valuable. A lot in the beginning of the book, I cover a lot of this, but there are a couple of great examples. One would be looking at Egyptian culture and the relationship between the world of the dead and the real world. Now, it's easy to dismiss that as sort of spiritual, religious mumbo jumbo, but I look at it in a more cold-hearted way, which is, why would people rationally behave this way? There must be some value being created by doing this. And the good news is a whole bunch of anthropologists and sociologists and historians would back that up and say, actually, this entire exercise was for the living, not the dead, right? There is a real commerce between these other realities. The mechanism of having this other world allows you to make this, to solve your society in different ways in the real world. So I think sport is a great example as well. And if we're looking at pure fiction, the writing of William Gibson, I would say, is a lot more interesting in trying to envision a realistic future. Although still kind of out there.
Yeah, which raises sort of, let's think about what is valuable, what is scarce, what's abundant in the metaverse. You talked about the fulfillment economy. I sometimes think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so what are the kinds of things that will be more valuable when people spend more, or are becoming more valuable in the metaverse versus in the world that most of us spend our time in?
We can derive this by looking at first principles of self-determination theory. I thoroughly recommend anybody wanting to understand the metaverse dig really deep into SDT. I had the privilege of talking to some of the researchers in the field as I was writing the book, but all experiences, all things we do through intrinsic motivation seem to end up being driven by a couple of categories of empirically validated motivations. So a great example is competence, right? The reason I enjoy playing competitive online shooters is because I feel more competent as I trounce my opponents. This cannot be faked, and this requires me to get a win rate of about 70%.
If there are other real human players, I mean, it does. Often they're non-player characters, right? And so
but interestingly,
are people going to be interacting mostly with other humans or with legions of AIs?
So there are both, but interestingly, players seem to disengage so sometimes to onboard players into new online games, customers and partners intentionally create fake bots, and they don't tell the players who are playing that the bots are bots. And they do this so that the players can experience winning, and they believe they've beaten.
Because they're beginners, they probably wouldn't.
So it's important that they feel they've beaten actual humans, right? And all that trick only works a little bit at the time, because after a while, you start to figure it out. So they usually do that for a couple of matches.
Why do you start to figure it out?
Because you're not seeing those people pop up on a leaderboard. You're not engaging with them. You're not getting the post-match kind of discussion. It only really works in very simple games.
But everything you just said could be faked if you wanted to.
You could. And I guess if you created an environment in which you had an entirely fake society where you were convinced all the people you were engaging with really existed in the real world but didn't. But I think we start to get into some pretty Truman Show levels of stuff.
Yeah, it is kind of. It is. That's
it becomes tough. I think in practice, it seems to matter a lot more. Like the biggest games in the world are multiplayer games. All of them. Single player gaming just makes nowhere near the kind of money that multiplayer gaming makes. And that's because we really care about achievements in the presence of other people. We care about autonomy and meaningful choices in the presence of other people. And to your point on scarcity, I can't be the best and you're the best at the same time. There's a fundamental scarcity in fulfillment when you consider that we're part of the same experience.
So we can replicate digital assets, but reputation or status, there's sort of like a finite hierarchy of that, and
Indeed.
humans seem to crave that, or a lot of people do.
And even in terms of choices and autonomy, right? Like role-playing games are a good example. Multiplayer role-playing games, like you can't all be the hero of the story, right? Somebody has to, it's quite interesting when you realize that scarcity falls out of building a compelling, consistent, fulfilling virtual world. It isn't something that needs to be engineered. You're just not going to build a fulfilling world without it. And I feel like it's tied together.
Different, like, there could be the champion of surfboarding and the champion of shooter games and the champion of X and Y and Z. So lots of people could be.
But here's where we get to the monetization, right? If people are buying digital assets, if those digital assets are valuable because everybody sees their relevance in that world, suddenly the number of people involved in that world matters. Getting a signed autograph from Roger Federer means a lot because everybody cares about tennis and everybody plays, and there's a lot of people who play tennis. If Roger Federer himself played tennis and he was the only person on the planet that cared about this game with a ball and a stick, even if he was the best in the world at it, nobody would give a crap.
Yeah.
So this is why the book's called Virtual Society, because the core basis of the value proposition here is that a grouping of people have to imbue a world with meaning, and that grouping is what then unlocks all the rest of this.
Is that a question, Kathy?
Actually, just in listening to you, it seems like a very gendered point of view. Like you have to compete, you have to dominate.
Oh, that's just one example.
And because a lot of men and women are more into cooperation and building something together. So it just sounded so macho.
Oh, well, to use the example of competitive gaming only touches 1/3 of the different fulfillment aspects. And I think you're really right to raise that. So a lot of people are surprised when they find out the gender split in gaming globally. There's about 3 and a bit billion gamers by some estimates. And actually, it's not what you'd think. It's pretty even with women. If you factor in games, especially games like Animal Crossing, games that have a lot more autonomy, choices, fulfillment, that seem to have a more even gender split. But even in those contexts, there's scarcity. So there's only so many of a certain kind of object. There's only so much land in the world. There's only so many meaningful choices that can be made, and only so many people that can make them.
So just to be clear, in terms of the people, humans, like real humans who are playing these games, it's about an even gender split?
Yeah, there's some games that are obviously, like Call of Duty is clearly more male dominated, but there's some, at this point, the industry is pretty evenly split.
And to Kathleen's point, do you find that there's different sets of motivations between men and women?
Well, so I can't speak to this because I haven't looked at specific research breaking down the forms of engagement for different genders, but I would conjecture that there is probably a very, very wide split, not just by gender, but by geography, cultural background, all sorts of, even by age. So it seems like older people who pay the most are not as interested in putting in loads of hours a week, but they're very consistent in the amount of hours they play. So there's like this 6-hour-a-week thing you see with kind of professionals above 30 who tend to play games in a pretty formulaic way.
Gotcha. Over here.
But that was a great question.
The question I had was how you think about the real world vis-a-vis the metaverse. I've heard a few different things. One is kind of the real world is just another world, almost like subservient to the metaverses at some point. Or the other vision is like the metaverses are kind of the real world is at the center of it all, and this enhances our experience. And a more practical question is, we haven't talked much about AR. How do you think about AR in the context of all of those?
And that's already a multi-part question, but at the risk of, so Reg Agrawal has a very related question online here. So we'll combine the real world with this online question, where he talks about, like, what about mixed reality and holographic reality, where you're integrating, the metaverse and the real world. And I guess AR is kind of.
I think the real world, for me, and the more I've looked at this sort of field, I think the real world itself is already dominated by vast amounts of made up stuff, right? There are so many different things, whether you look at the value within fashion or celebrity, music, culture, IP, whatever it might be. The real world consists of a very large number of industries that are actually profoundly under-monetized when you consider how much time and energy people spend engaging with these things and how little value per user or engagement per user is created. So I think the real world is going to be the source of all of that IP, all of that value, all of that celebrity. And I think the biggest winners in the metaverse short term are going to be huge audience groups. Like FC Barcelona, a football club in Spain, they claim to have 1 billion fans and to make roughly about $500 million. I heard this from kind of indirectly, from those fans. It's pretty pitiful when you consider
like
the number of
50 cents per person.
Pitiful, right? When
Is
you
that per
consider,
year?
when you consider the scale of their fan base. And similarly, if you're like a famous athlete, or if you're a famous musician or celebrity, like in K-pop, a great example, they make very, very little money given the actual total attention and power they command. So I think those people will be the initial winners. In terms of AR and VR, once again, like these are all new ways of having experiences. They can totally play into building more engaging experiences, but they're not the disruption. The disruption is that the events, the things that happen in these worlds can suddenly start to matter a lot more. That is what is creating a different relationship between us and these experiences. That's what makes it more than a game.
Mark?
So I think we've kind of made a lot of metaphors with property and talking about society. So one of the things I'm thinking about is gentrification. So one London to another, you look at areas of London that start off populated by maybe kind of like immigrant populations, and then kind of creators and queer people move in and become these exciting places to live. And then property developers say, that's cool. And then they build a load of glass buildings and chain restaurants, and everyone says, well, that's not cool anymore in the Metaverse. So that's kind of like fulfillment in a way. And I feel like the metaverse was started off by, again, kind of artists, people who are interested in what the ontology of digital spaces means, kind of philosophical questions, right? And then you see kind of corporations saying that looks kind of cool, and then build places like Meta, or I saw a large management consultant's metaverse recently described as like the 7th layer of hell on Twitter the other day, naming no names. And I work in the corporate partnerships team for Stanford High, and see a lot of big players wanting to just throw money at the metaverse. And there's a danger that, I wonder if you think it's a space that could be gentrified before it even starts.
If you don't build fulfilling experiences in a context people want to participate in, you have nothing of value. So if you come with a big soulless empty corporate room and you're like, have fun in there, right? People aren't going to do it. So, sorry?
What is the risk of that happening?
The risk of that happening is not that high, just because, as we see with Facebook, like those retention numbers are so bad that it can never sustain the investment being made. I mean,
The risk, so it could be happening, but then people will go elsewhere.
Yeah, I would say it's a bit like in the early and in the late 90s, there were a lot of .com businesses that had no business being internet businesses, right? They were pretty terrible uses of the internet. We can all, like, not to name names, we can all think of those hilarious companies back then, and they failed, right? And the ones that succeeded were ones that actually delivered value to users. So I think that this is such a brutal industry. Like, if we step away from the metaverse and just look at video games, user retention is horrifyingly hard to do. Companies spend billions on acquiring users that then immediately churn, right? And then it can only monetize them in a little bit of a fraction. So there's a reason why really big companies, Activision's a great example. If you look at their last releases, they've done absolutely no new IP. They've almost entirely focused on pre-existing games. Same reason why you see so many Marvel movies every year, right? It's really difficult to build an audience when you don't have one.
The question was about like the artistic cool factor, and then companies coming in to monetize it. But your answer, it sounded like you're saying that the monetization will prevent it from becoming uncool.
Because there just won't be value in those worlds.
So are you kind of, do you believe that monetization pushes you towards keeping the coolness and the?
Yeah, maybe it would be illuminating to sort of double click on how these worlds come about. So I'll come to, well, not quite, and I'll come to why. So great online and virtual worlds throughout the history of the medium have been grown and not built. A spark happens, people sort of enjoy a particular experience, a community comes together, and then the world evolves, iterates.
The users are contributing a lot.
Exactly. They're often contributing directly or indirectly. So, World of Warcraft kind of happened, and then Blizzard's been kind of fanning the spark of that. Second Life is similar. It's very difficult to just decide that I'm going to make a culture or make a community. You end up having to, most online games fail. The vast majority of them fail. So one of the things my company does is reduce the cost of that failure so people can take many, many bites at the apple and create a lot of content that relates to each other. So on the one hand, I think that's unlikely. On the other hand, when you think about gentrification, it's still going to happen. It's still going to happen because in every instance where you bring a crowd of people together in a game-like environment, they want the drama. They want something to aspire to. They seem to consistently want winners and losers. It just keeps coming. So I don't think the metaverse is going to be like an idealized society. I think the metaverse is going to be like an idealized environment to have adventures, right? To have fulfilling experiences. Think of Narnia, right? Narnia would have been really boring if, like, when they arrived there was nothing to do. Like, Narnia, we've declared world peace, it's all great. Nobody wants that. That doesn't allow for achievement and for fulfillment.
So, I mean, some of the people, Mark Zuckerberg said the same thing about social media when it first came out, this connect the world and everybody. And then I think to his and a lot of people's surprise, ended up being a lot of polarization and misinformation. Are you worried about other sort of unintended, and someone asked earlier about racism, et cetera, these negatives may be emerging or being worse in the metaverse?
I definitely think that's possible, but I think this is both why I don't think companies like Meta have as much of a head start, and also why I'm really excited by the space, which is identity. So, you can be whoever you want to be in a virtual world or in a game. And nobody needs to know who you really are, what race you are, what gender you are, what background. You can even try an entirely new identity. You could even develop an entirely new identity that never existed before. And you see this happening in crypto to some extent, of course, famously with Satoshi Nakamoto, but also with all sorts of people in the space who are sort of pseudonymous in different ways. I use the term the multiversal self, the idea that we can be a self that isn't restricted by one identity, but multiple people. You are going to be many people in many contexts, right? And I think that's really thrilling and really exciting. But of course, it needs to be nurtured. And we need to balance that with the need to protect people when real money is involved from things like scams. So how we do that is going to be a big challenge.
Well, it connects to one of the questions here by Christer Oberach, which is how do you see privacy and data protection working in the metaverse? I mean, in your question, I guess there's implicit you can't connect it to the person, or should you be able to connect it to the person?
Let's come to that. I do want to round off on the previous question. There was an important point here, which is right now at this moment in time, while I talk to you, there are statistically, almost certainly, young men and women and other genders that are on opposite sides of a war zone and are probably match made together on the same mobile game, probably on the same team, like statistically, right? The last place on earth where it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, where you're from or what you do, where you get to, on an equal footing, interact with other people is a video game. It's the last place, right? If you don't have national service in your country, it is the very last place. And people make friends all the time. People get married, people engage together that would never have met without these experiences. So there is the potential there for something that is pretty powerful for our society. To your point on personal data, this is why I believe that you really need to have some kind of commons, digital commons, which is co-owned by multiple companies. And that's not just to protect consumers, it's to protect business interests. I mean,
they would have some kind of rules, some kind of ground
rules. So this is
rules.
what we're doing with M Squared. So every partner can have their own user accounts. Everybody can control their own, everyone can have their own front door. But behind the scenes, everything relates together in a common format, which can be accessed by everybody like a platform. But that platform isn't punitively monetizing. That platform only captures a small amount of value.
Do you have a view as to whether they should be linked to a real identity? They should have to identify themselves, or should they?
I think it's inevitable that we're going to need some form of correlation, partly because of the amount of money involved. Like very quickly as the economies of these worlds open up, you already see this with some of the biggest names in the space. You're seeing land going for hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? You're seeing individual digital assets become priceless, and that's likely to continue. So I think it's hard to see how we get around problems like money laundering, the funding of terrorism, the protection of children without some form of real identity relationship. But I think that relationship it's not going to be one-to-one. I think you'll need to prove who you are in order to do certain things. I don't think it'll be an obligation.
Gotcha. Did you have a question?
Great questions, by the way.
Yeah, so from your comments until now, I understand that you don't see as a probable scenario to have like a couple of companies, Meta or other big companies dominating the metaverse. Is that true? And in a what-if scenario, if that happens, what are the risks you see involved?
Well, let's look at the evidence, right? Where's the corporate blockchain? Could be, where's Microsoft blockchain or Google's or Amazon's? Why are we still using Ethereum? Why did Facebook fail so miserably to kind of, obviously there was regulatory challenges, but you can see now with Aptos and Mistin that spun out of Facebook. I think that each of these large tech companies itself is the product of a blind spot from the company that came before it. Google really shouldn't have been allowed to exist, given the existence of Microsoft and Yahoo and these other companies. It was kind of wild that it was able to do that. Facebook should never have been allowed to exist, where the companies that dominate.
When you say allowed, you mean just that in the capitalist system, not that the government should have.
No. What I mean to say is, if the existing incumbents had played their cards correctly, I would be surprised. And I think what we found is that innovator's dilemma affects big tech companies just as easily as it affects anybody else. A classic example here is digital assets. Like why you don't see big gaming companies entering and winning in the space of building kind of crypto-powered games is because it's just fundamentally contrary to their business model. Like if I sell $1 billion of skins, but now there's a resale market because those cosmetic items are digital assets, suddenly my primary revenue goes down. It's not something I necessarily want to do. So I do think there are a lot of obstructions in those companies entering in. I think Meta might have been it. They might have actually bucked that trend. Like the name change, the absolute focus. There's a lot to admire about that, right? About really disrupting your own business. The problem is VR. The bet on the hardware is just so costly, so tangential to the main value proposition of the metaverse, and so outside of, and so difficult to see how they claim that investment back. I think that's a real issue. You know,
But there could be many incumbents, right? And what's the risk of having monopolies in this area?
I think we should be more concerned about a different kind of monopoly entirely. Like, let's look at Ethereum as a great example. Is that, you know, because I suspect the EVM ecosystem and Ethereum will end up largely dominating a very big part of the sort of digital asset infrastructure. It's very difficult to know who to like sue or arrest in that context. Somebody described it a venture capitalist described it to me very evilly as a legitimate monopoly, because it is absolutely centralized, right? There's only a small number of people that are really responsible for contributing code and defining the direction, like many open source projects. But it has all of the protections of not being centralized or being owned by anybody. So I think these sort of like networks or cartel-like structures are probably more likely to be how a metaverse comes about, and will require different kinds of regulation.
Do you think they'll be on the scope of governments and regulation, or do you think that there'll always be that the traditional governments will still be able to?
It's like they're always regulating the last thing, you know, like this is the real problem. It's almost like fighting the last war. I think government, look at how well government has handled Facebook's current monopoly power. Like, they've just unwound the Giphy acquisition in the UK. Mm-hmm. They're being incredibly careful about preventing them from becoming a bank or launching their own cryptocurrency.
But that's Facebook. I mean, part of the argument that some people make for blockchain, Ethereum, et cetera, is it's going to be beyond the reach.
I don't think that's realistic.
Okay.
I think we need government involved.
Mm-hmm.
I think without kind of, I think if government were to say we're not interested in defense, we don't do defense,
Mm-hmm.
well, leaving that to somebody else, we'd all be like, what's the point of government?
Mm-hmm.
I think if we're all going to live and experience and spend more and more of our lives in virtual worlds,
Mm-hmm.
if our jobs are going to be there, if our education is going to be there, of course we want government. Otherwise, what is it governing?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like,
yeah.
You know, and that's why
we still have physical beings that we,
no,
yeah,
and that's why we need those Federalist Papers. We need researchers, thinkers, people, hopefully in the seminar, to like start generating the framework, because government needs help.
Question?
Hi, yeah. Slight tangent, but you mentioned jobs and work and education will be in these spaces. But earlier you said Zoom meetings in VR, not really the thing. I teach my class in VR. My students and I are all there. It's pretty meaningful, but cool. It's not.
What's the class?
Avatar psychology, actually. So.
Well, that's a perfect class for VR.
And so I'd like, actually, could you push back on your earlier comment and maybe describe, not in the game space, but in the workspace, how you see the technology unfold?
So a meeting of 4 people or 2 people or 1 person, I don't necessarily see as being superior, especially one on short notice in the context of an avatar. But if you want 1,000 people to meet, or 10,000 people to meet, or a seminar like this, where there's a lot of us listening, in my experience, building rich avatar environments with loads of people in them becomes a much better way for that to happen. Like, I conduct my company town halls every week in a multi-thousand person virtual world. So we have avatars, we have a screen, we zoom into that screen. People can connect on any device wherever they are.
But it's 2D?
It's 3D. You could, if you wanted to, you could like VR headset in, I guess, but it isn't necessarily that convenient for a lot of people to do that. Mm-hmm. But everyone can hear everyone. So you can hear the murmur, the reaction of the crowd. People can also have emotes that they can kind of do to signal whether they're happy or sad. So the whole situation completely changes, right? So I think having two-way communication with crowds is the killer app, you know, for short term. Eventually, when the fidelity and the quality of those devices is good enough, of course we'll use them for things like Zoom. My point is, I just don't think it's the first use case.
Well, just building on that question, so we talked a lot about gaming and virtual worlds, and a little bit about like town halls and stuff. Are there other business use cases that, and you mentioned you did some stuff with the military and simulations. Can you rattle off a couple of other business use cases that you see as
large-scale training? I mean, right now, if you want to train 50,000 people, that's an international incident. You can't have 50,000 soldiers just show up somewhere and start practicing something. Well, you can with technology like ours and the work that we do, and others are doing as well. You can also start to run what-if scenarios and simulations, or even train people in the context of these environments. I also think another powerful aspect of this is education, but in the context of giving everybody around the world access to effectively like the equivalent of a digital campus, like a lecture hall, where not only can they listen to the direct person, but interact with other students. You know, like it's, to go back to use the kind of early internet example, selling groceries in 1996, probably not the best idea. Selling books, pretty good idea, because it solves a problem that isn't well solved by the availability within stores. And I think we have to find those wedges.
Experiment. I mean, if someone had come to me with the idea for Wikipedia, I would have said, no, that's never going to work. And so you wanted to sort of let people try things, and then you can't always predict.
The experiments are actually quite instructive. Like our own experiments have shown us behaviors we never expected in crowds. For example, crowds behave themselves at scale in games, but not at small scales. I think we're the first people to show this. Like 5 people misbehave. 2,000 people follow instructions. Couldn't tell you why. Don't know why. No incentives. no, you're not punished.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but they
Interesting
seem to.
psychology, yeah. There's a few questions here about the technology and how it's evolving and changing. So, so Seth Benzel notes that you said that VR is not really indispensable, but what are some of the other technologies that might be important that are emerging? And then a little edgier one down here. Let me see if I can find it here. Is Mohammed Abdul Ghaffar asked about what about haptics and how that plays into porn and other types of things. So
Okay.
you can touch that if you want.
We're gonna. I don't know if I want to touch that, given the. But what I'll say is the most important technology to support the metaverse is the field of distributed systems. So how do you support very large simulations? How do you manage vast amounts of communication between many devices? The propagation of events occurring in the world in efficient ways, given bandwidth and given the back-end computation necessary to manage things like physics, is the problem. It is the problem. And the reason that people avoid it is because it's fiendishly, ridiculously difficult. The messages grow like more than quadratically as the number of participants in a world increase.
Why does it go more than quadratic?
Because you speak, and let's say there's 10 people in a room, right? So you do something, 10 people need to hear about it. Then they interact back, and 10 more people need to respond.
Okay.
So everybody,
it's not just pairwise.
Yeah, it's because of the fact it's a very, very connected group. And then the other problem is they're very, very high, very low tolerances for things like latency. And so suddenly you have this very low latency system processing billions of messages a second and needing to do all of that while deciding how to render everything on screen.
Does the speed of light become a limit?
It hasn't yet, thankfully, but it does when you think about certain kinds of experiences.
When you're going to people on different sides of the Earth?
There's technology and approaches, some we've moved forward, which involve making predictions about how things will be to try to overcome some of that, but there'll always be endgame limitations.
So if you've got two gamers fighting and one of them moves and they're 10,000 miles away, you have to anticipate and predict it.
And for some types of games, it'll never be feasible because of the speed of light. But we found for most applications, such as massive crowds of people, even having like melee battles, and particularly against NPCs, we've been able to make that work really, really well. There's loads of demos online if people want to check them out.
Okay. Other questions? Oh, sorry. Back here, Rita.
So just a quick, going back to your point and Abhishek's earlier question. So about the boundaries of what works well in the real world and versus the metaverse. So would it make what do you think about the idea that things where novelty, creativity, creative industries generally translate well, whereas sort of systems where reliability, those types of things don't work as well? And I'm thinking, having looked at video games as a research topic, and then what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of things generalize from that setting, tends to be they generalize well to creative industries, but not much beyond. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that the first experiences are definitely going to come from creative industries. I would totally buy that. And I think especially where you want, not the only ones, because I think when you have a large group of people trying to cooperate, co-create, or imagine something, I think I wouldn't rule out some pretty inventive use cases of the metaverse to support those areas. So I'd be loath to say no, because to your point, Wikipedia, a lot of people would have said no, and then it worked out. So I mean, I think the low-hanging fruit is very, very simple. I can even give you a recipe because I can see it empirically. The low-hanging fruit is any large distributed community with high interest but low engagement and a low opportunity to meet and have experiences together. Those will be the first adopters of the metaverse. Those will be the beginning of a lot of these businesses and where those things go.
Well, what made me think of that point is you said earlier that you don't want to be part of the world where creativity or novel ideas are not valued. So that's kind of the mechanism of your.
Yeah, if we could twist what you're saying in a way which is, if you were to do a workplace in the metaverse, for example, in order for anyone to remain engaged in that environment, you're going to need for that to be restructured quite radically. So a really great example is a lot of people we've worked with have tried to be quite skeuomorphic in how they build environments. So we work with a really famous architecture firm for one of our projects, and they wanted people to walk around from place to place. It's really boring to do that when you can fly or jump around on a giant pad. And when you watch a crowd of people in the metaverse, they're constantly moving because they can. Right, and they want to continually express themselves. Whereas we all, we have limited energy. You guys can't hop up and down continuously throughout this meeting. So you need to design differently for avatars, and you need to think differently about how to keep them continually engaged and stimulated.
Yeah, that's great. There's so much more we could talk about. For those of you who want to learn more, this book is a fun to read book. It's filled with a lot of facts about it. And your company, Improbable, is doing amazing things. So congratulations, and thanks for joining us. And next week we have Bindu Reddy joining us. She's going to be talking about embedding cutting-edge AI into business process and applications, and she'll be both here in person and online as we live the life that Herman has been describing. Thanks again, Herman, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
All righty.
Fun.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Good stuff.